Welcome, everybody, to this podcast introduction to this week's program 10 Things About Margaret Bayard Smith. Lindsay, we had a great and spirited conversation about Margaret Bayard Smith. We owe her so much for detail about the character of Jefferson, the world of the White House of Jefferson, the world of Monticello after his presidency. She's one of the chief sources we have on the inaugural day, March 4th, 1801. What does it say that we still don't know much about these people like Margaret Bayard Smith, that she's still sort of almost a footnote in history? We mine her letters and her diaries for material, but we don't really focus on what a remarkable human being she was.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things. So, for one, for a long time, history books, like the initial history books that were written in the 19th century about the revolution and then about the early years, were really focused on capital G, capital M, great men, and the treaties they signed and the wars that they fought. And Lord knows I'm interested in that stuff. So, I'm not saying that we shouldn't write about that. But it didn't give a whole lot of space for women, people of color, people of lower classes. It was really about the big events that served sort of as, like section headers in a textbook, if you will. So I think that that's part of it, and that we're still sort of catching up in some ways, trying to know more about people who just were a little bit more on the outskirts, or even just sort of in the background at some of these big events. The second piece is a lot of it is source based. So Margaret Bayard Smith is relatively remarkable as 19th and early or as 18th and early 19th century women go, and that we actually have a pretty extraordinary paper record about what she was up to and what she was doing and what she was thinking. For a lot of women and a lot of people of color and a lot of lower class white people at the time, they either were illiterate or their papers were not preserved, and so we just don't have that much to try and document their life. I mean, and even now, if you think about our lives, we write so many emails, we put so much out on social media, we do all of these things, but think about how much that takes place that isn't recorded. Your conversations, your thoughts, unless you're writing a diary, which most people don't do now. There's just a lot that is not captured, and that was even more so back then.
Yeah. So yesterday I gave a lecture here in Bismarck on 10 of the greatest photographs of all time. And of course, it was 30, 40, really. It's hard to choose 10. But a friend of mine earlier in the day, a man here in Bismarck, had sent me a photograph of a woman named Lee Miller, who was a photographer, a combat photographer and reporter during World War II. And she took a bath in Adolf Hitler's bathtub in Munich on the day of his suicide as an act of, she's Jewish, as an act of defiance. And we have a photograph of it. And so I looked it up, and then she was a model. She was on the cover of Vogue. She was a beautiful model and was in many photo shoots. She was the lover of Man Ray, the great photographer, and his muse. She did this extraordinary reporting and photojournalism during the war, and I had never heard of her. Now, that's just maybe a sign of my ignorance, but you've never heard of her either. And then there's Leni Riefenstahl, the great propaganda filmmaker. You've heard of her, that did Triumph of the Will. And Hannah Reich was a female pilot who came in at the last hours of Hitler's life and landed in the middle of the rubble of Berlin to try to take him away, to get him out from Berlin and to save him for maybe another fight on the Bavarian, in the Bavarian Alps. And these are just three women that we should all know about. And how different. Hannah Reich, who's an ardent Nazi but a great female pilot. Leni Riefenstahl, one of the greatest documentary filmmakers of all time. And then Lee Miller, whom I've literally never heard of. And I thought, I mean, what else don't I know? But that's like shooting ducks in a bathtub. But what don't we know? Why don't we know? Why are these things surprises to us when I know a lot about the men around Hitler in Berlin in World War II? We all do. There's just been a way in which there's so much catching up to do that it's really inspiring. And I could see you writing I know you have your next projects in mind, but a book on Margaret Bayard Smith would be a superb book.
It would. Well, and I'm guilty of this too, because I really like studying power and how people use it. And for most of history, women really had soft power, and certainly they used that soft power, whether it was, the hostessing that we've talked about with Dolley Madison, which was really almost more like diplomacy, in a lot of ways, or, family matchmaking or what have you. But I kind of like studying the hard power. And so, what that means is, and so, I'm so guilty of this that, until like I remember, early on when I was writing the cabinet, and I did my best to include wives and spouses when I could, but people basically said, like, where are the women? I'm like, they're not in the cabinet. I don't know what to tell you.
What do you
Like,
want
they're
me to
just not
tell you
there.
here?
Yeah.
I'll let you go. Thank you, Lindsay. We'll talk again. This was really a great program. See you shortly. All right, everyone. That was Lindsay Chervinsky, my dear friend. We've become really good friends. It's just a wonderful thing. I read her book, The Cabinet, which I very much liked, of course. And then David Swenson and I invited her to come on the program. She came on. We just really liked her. She's so refreshing. She has a sense of humor. She has a sense of self-effacing humor. And, she's kind of anti-Jefferson in some important respects. But it's a lot of it's done in fun. And my goal is when we're done with this, after 10 years or whenever we stop recording things together, my goal is that she will say, Mr. Jenkinson, I have to say you have changed my view of Thomas Jefferson. You have made me realize the greatness, the beauty, the vision of Mr. Jefferson. That may or may not happen, but so it goes. I love our conversations together, and there will be many more, I can assure you. And if you have thoughts about 10 things, I was thinking of 10 women that every American should know about that we don't know about. That would be a good program. We're going to do a program, Elizabeth Warren, who wrote a history, an interminably long history of the Revolution, which really upset John Adams. There's just so much more. I will be leaving around May 1st, sometime in the first week of May, traveling the country for a few months, but I'll come back to North Dakota to regroup and do laundry. And then I will be, once I finish the Travels of Charlie, John Steinbeck tour, which will occur within this calendar year or just beyond, then I'll regroup, and there will be a second tour of maybe the Lewis and Clark Trail from Monticello all the way to Astoria and back again, and Theodore Roosevelt's Footprint in America, Alexis de Tocqueville's America. I plan to go to all the national monuments that I can, to many of the national parks, although I'm not a checklister in that way. Certainly I want to go to all the presidential libraries. I find them utterly fascinating, to historic sites, to battlefields, to the great national forests, to BLM lands, to places that are just out in the middle of nowhere. I want to travel the back highways of this country. I can't wait to go through the redwoods with my Airstream and find a beautiful spot in the national forest to stop and camp for the night. This is really going to be a very extraordinary journey, and I want you to be part of it. We're putting all of the infrastructure in place for this, and it will begin in May of 2024. So what a day with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky on 10 things about Margaret Bayard Smith. If you can help us in any way as we go on this great journey, we will deeply appreciate it. And of course, it's all tax deductible and so on and so forth. So go to the website, ltamerica.org, sign up for our newsletter, tell your friends, and keep listening. Thank you, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. My friend Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky is across the country from me, but we are virtually together on a Zoom technology. And today, 10 things about Margaret Bayard Smith. Margaret Bayard Smith was a prominent woman in Washington, D.C. during the early national period. She first moved there in 1800 with her husband Samuel Harrison Smith. He was the editor of the National Intelligencer, the newspaper that was in some sense a house organ of the Jefferson administration, and she became a really extraordinary diarist and letter writer, and her writings were published after her life as The First 40 Years of Washington Society, a really remarkable book, one of the best windows we have on the new federal capital in the age of Jefferson all the way through the age of Andrew Jackson. So welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. She's going to be the subject of, I think, a very fun chat.
Her dates are 1778 to 1844, so she was 35 years younger than Mr. Jefferson, and she lived 18 years after his death on July 4th, 1826. And I'm going to use this term, and you can object to it if you want, but she was sort of, in some ways, a groupie. That's not really fair, but she had a crush on Thomas Jefferson. She had a very serious crush on Jefferson. She was happily married, and there was no shenanigans of any sort, but she sort of adored him, and she made it her business to be someone who provided unlimited affection and support to the third president, who was, as you know, a widower, and his daughters, for the most part, remained back in Charlottesville during his 2 terms as president. So I know that's an unfair term, Lindsay, but you know she had this crush on Mr. J.
Yeah, I'm not really actually sure it is an unfair term. So her initial interaction with him is so funny because in her 40 years, she describes it. And it's important to remember, of course, at this time, there wasn't photography and there wasn't the internet. So you might have a description of what someone looked like, but you didn't necessarily know all that well unless you had seen a portrait. And evidently, she didn't know what he looked like. And so he came into their house and she thought he was a professional acquaintance of her husband's and sort of, dismissed him out of hand and then realized that it was the president elect. This was right after the election, and was horrified that she had, treated him with not disdain or anything, but just hadn't been as fawning as she would become once she knew who he was. And went on to serve as, I think Dolley Madison was sort of the unofficial hostess of the White House when Jefferson's daughters were not around, but certainly Margaret Bayard Smith was an important female figure. And one of the items on our list is her visit to Monticello after his retirement, which we'll get into more. But in that sort of diary of this visit, the unbelievable amount of praise and fawning that is in. I mean, at one point I was like, are you kidding me? Because it's so ridiculous.
I know it's enough to make you gag, but it just shows what a great person he was. So just to set up that scene, it's 1800, the election is over, but Jefferson's not yet president, but he's sort of clearly the president-elect. He comes to the Smith residence in Washington. Washington is a tiny town of a couple of thousand people, and really not much there. A Treasury building is being built. The White House is unfinished. The Capitol is unfinished. Pennsylvania Avenue is all mud. And Jefferson comes calling at the Smith residence, and in this time the manners were very formal. And so she brushes into the drawing room or wherever he's waiting for Samuel Harrison Smith and sees this stranger, thinks nothing of it. Her husband walks in and says, "Oh, Mr. Jefferson, may I congratulate you on your ascent to the presidency?" And she has this kind of meltdown. So she starts to blush and, everything. And she says, this is what she says in her famous account. "And is this the violent Democrat, the vulgar demagogue, the bold atheist and profligate man I had so often heard denounced by the Federalists? Can this man, so meek and mild, yet dignified in his manners, with a voice so soft and low, with a countenance so benignant and intelligent, can he be that daring leader of a faction, that disturber of the peace, that enemy of all rank and order?" Think of what she had been sort of told by the Fox News of her time. Jefferson is this crazy leftist radical, who's going to tear down the government. He's a demagogue. He's a vulgarian.
Well, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, didn't she come from a Federalist family?
She is from a Federalist family, so she had this kind of belly full of anti-Jeffersonian feeling, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Then he appears, she meets him, and she's overwhelmed by his sweetness of temper, his suavity, his gracefulness, his mild-mannered nature, his lack of political vitriol. And thus begins the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Margaret Bayard Smith. And so even you can appreciate this moment, right? That this must have been some moment.
Yeah, well, and I've had the occasion to occasionally put my foot in my mouth, and I just am utterly mortified when that happens. And so I can understand the feeling of being just, you're just horrified. You just want to crawl under a table and die. And usually I can sort of redeem myself, but I can imagine how she felt in that moment and how ridiculous she just must have been feeling terrible. But it certainly is a great story. And it starts a very, very, actually, what I think is actually probably a very sweet friendship. I think that they probably had a sort of paternal bond. It was probably quite lovely.
This is an age before media. So today it would be unthinkable that somebody wouldn't know that the president-elect had just entered their house. But in this era, she would have had no reason to know what Thomas Jefferson looked like. Suddenly Thomas Jefferson is there. She had this prejudice that had come from her upbringing about the kind of small d wild Democrat that Jefferson was, and he turned out to be a perfect gentleman. And then for the next 8 years, they had many, many encounters in the White House and in her house. And when Alexander von Humboldt came to visit the president on his way back from his extraordinary explorations in South America, she served as a kind of hostess to him. Humboldt was able to kind of come and go in the White House with no security, and Jefferson greatly admired Alexander von Humboldt, but he needed some help, and so Dolley Madison provided some of it, and Margaret Bayard Smith provided other parts of the hospitality regimen that was needed for this distinguished German polymath and explorer. So she has this relationship with Jefferson, and in her books and letters, her book is really a set of letters and diary entries, but she talks about several really interesting things. First of all, Jefferson had a mockingbird named Dick that he used to allow to hop around and fly around freely in the White House, and it would sit on his fingers and eat crumbs from his lips. And Jefferson just loved this bird. She said Jefferson cannot live without something to love. Jefferson has to love things, and this bird was one of them. And then she also talks about trees with Jefferson, Lindsay, and strangely, she said that Jefferson believed that any time a tree was cut down unnecessarily, it was a kind of murder, that it was a terrible thing to cut down a tree unnecessarily.
Well, and I think that one of the things that her writings do so well, and we should talk about some of her, in addition to her 40 years, she also published a fair amount while she was alive, so we should circle back to that. One of the things that's really nice about the 40 years is it does describe what Washington, D.C. was like, both who was there, but also what it looked like, and what buildings were there, and what flora and fauna was there. And I think one of the things that Jefferson disliked about a lot of European cities is that they often didn't have a whole lot of green space. They weren't necessarily built intentionally in the way that Washington, D.C. was laid out ahead of time. Cities tended to kind of crop up organically and then expand organically, and space was at a premium. And so you cut down trees because you needed firewood for your fire and you needed space for people. And so one of the things that was so important to Jefferson about the design of Washington, D.C. was that it had green space. And that's why so many of the roads and the circles have built-in parks as part of this important preservation. But the people around town didn't necessarily have it's not like the trees on federal land were protected by the National Park Service like they are today. And so he was horrified when these beautiful native trees were cut down.
And so from a certain point of view, he's sort of way ahead of his time, believing in green space. He actually wrote letters saying that since the West hadn't been settled by white people yet, every new community should be laid out on a checkerboard system, and every other square should be permanent parkland. So imagine this. This was tried in Indiana and also in Missouri. It failed because it wasn't long before the Hamiltonians realized this is really valuable space that we can make money on. But Jefferson said we can thus pastoralize the city. We can redeem the city as healthy space by having green things growing and a place for people to leave the congestion of Congress or the congestion of their homes and go out into parkland. So this makes him a very modern, sort of forward-thinking person. Back to Mrs. Smith. So she's 22 years old when she meets Jefferson. He's a lot older than she is. And he would never have engaged in an illicit relationship with her, but he was quite happy to have this sort of platonic light romance, let's call it. And her husband understood this and was not at all threatened by it. In fact, made jokes about it.
We should clarify the reason he wouldn't necessarily engage in romance is not necessarily because we think that he had certain high-minded ideals about romance, but because her husband, Samuel, was a very important political ally, and it would have been a scandal, and that would have been very politically damaging. And Jefferson, I think, was way too savvy to engage in behavior that would have been politically damaging out in the open like that. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I do. That Jefferson was a very smart man, and he understood the dynamics of these things. At the same time, I think it would have been very unlikely for Jefferson to be interested in a person that much younger than himself. That he would have maintained the propriety. And of course, we all know that back at Monticello, he had already made some quiet arrangements for his own. Back to the theme of her life as a writer. She not only kept these diaries and sent these letters to her sister and sisters-in-law, but she also wrote a couple of novels. Interestingly enough, I've never read them. One is called A Winter in Washington, or Memoirs of the Seymour Family. Another, that was 1824, so Jefferson's an old man back at Monticello by now. Second one is What is Gentility, from 1825. And then she wrote several biographical. She often wrote for her husband's newspaper, sometimes under her own byline, but more often anonymously, which was much more common in those days. She also wrote for the National Portrait Gallery of Distinguished Americans in 1836, profile of her friend Dolley Madison. We need to take a break, Lindsay. When we come back, I want to ask you about Margaret Bayard Smith's friendship with First Lady Dolley Madison. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to 10 Things About Margaret Bayard Smith with my friend and guest, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Lindsay, this is really a remarkable woman, and she deserves to be better remembered than she was, I think. She was a friend of Dolley Madison. Talk about that, please.
Yeah, well, I also wanted to circle back to what you said about her letters, because one of the things that is so important about this period of time is even the writings that she was not publishing, her letters, those types of sources for historians and for us to understand how the world worked, they're so essential, because they often described interactions and events and people in a way that newspapers would not. And so that type of letter from one sister to another is absolutely golden. And I've used them a lot in my work when they are available. Of course, women's letters were not necessarily preserved in the same way that men's always were. So it's always a treasure trove when they are preserved and are preserved in a way that really does give us an interesting sense of the world. And she was keenly aware of the limitations for women, but was also really ambitious to try and do more. She apparently wrote later in her life that she wanted to plunge into the daring enterprises of life. A man's sphere was unlimited, but I am a woman, and society says, thus far and no further shall thou come. Why then has nature given me a mind so active and inquiring? She certainly shows it in her letters. She's just delightful. But in terms of her friendship with Dolley Madison, these were both warm and, from all accounts, quite lively and vivacious women. There weren't that many women who actually lived permanently in DC because a lot of the congressmen just came in for the season and did not bring their families. So the wives of the executive department secretaries and the president and the vice president tended to spend time together and tended to spend time with the more permanent families in Washington, D.C., of which Margaret was one. And so they became friends. They were, I think, fairly close in age and had known each other for a really long time. And so by the time Margaret wrote this sort of interview or feature on Dolley, she had known Dolley for decades, and so really had a very clear sense of who she was and her strengths, but of course also her weaknesses and her flaws. And by the time she wrote it, they were in pretty bad financial straits, largely because of Dolley's son, who was kind of a wastrel. She wrote this feature of Dolley and was very flattering. She did not say any of the bad things, and Dolley was very pleased. This was published in 1836, so just to give you a sense of the timing. And apparently Margaret wrote to her sister, "All I say about Dolley is true, but I have not, of course, told the whole truth."
Fair enough. I just want to repeat the sentence that you quoted from her. I am a woman, and society says, thus far and no further shall thou come. Why then has nature given me a mind so active and inquiring. You can't read that without a pang of sorrow for the patriarchy that prevented women from achieving their potential. It has a certain echo of Mary Wollstonecraft's writings and a certain echo of Abigail Adams. But Lindsay, if you think of all the women of history who have been straitjacketed by patriarchal social norms, who might have done extraordinary things and even did against all the odds in their lives, it's both heartbreaking and hopeful at the same time, isn't it?
It is. I cannot read those types of letters without shuddering in horror about what my life would have been if I had been born in a different century. I would not have tolerated those straitjackets particularly well, and so I am extremely sympathetic. I don't like being told what to do ever, and so I can't imagine what that felt like. I think about there are amazing women who have done incredible things like Marie Curie. I think about how many of those types of people we didn't know about because they weren't allowed to go to school and they weren't allowed to be educated in the way that would allow their talents to really shine. How many people like that have we lost to history because they weren't allowed to exercise their full talents? It does make me quite sad.
And just flashing forward to the turn of the 20th century, Alice Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's eldest daughter, was by all accounts extraordinarily intelligent. She understood power. She was every bit her father's daughter, but there was nowhere for her to put her mighty talents. At this time, a president's daughter couldn't really do anything except maybe volunteer with the Red Cross in a time of danger or something, but she couldn't be a teacher, she couldn't be a nurse, she couldn't be a writer. And what she became then was a rebel, which I suppose you would have done too. I mean, she doesn't talk about this much, but it's all there, that the world was holding her back and putting her in a very narrow box. And instead of using her to her really extraordinary talents, even TR couldn't find a role for her. And that comes out therefore in a kind of anger and aggression in her character, which could have been put to extraordinary use. And this story happens again and again and again and again.
Well, and I always think about, obviously the patriarchy was still very much in existence and was powerful, but you can tell often the women that do okay with it, their relationships with their husbands facilitate an outlet.
Say a little bit more about Dolly Madison's son, because this is like almost like a Jane Austen novel. There's always that guy, son from the previous marriage, who's a wastrel who can never get it together, who has huge gambling debts, who has a drinking problem, and he conforms to this model, doesn't he?
Yeah, so there are a couple of issues I think at hand. One, they obviously did not have an understanding of addiction like we do, whether it be gambling or drinking, and it seems like her son had both, and in really intense ways. And they tried they tried to keep tabs on him so that he couldn't go out and go gambling and disappear, and it didn't work. There's also a lot of evidence to suggest that she just like couldn't say no to him and couldn't instill any form of discipline. And James Madison either couldn't or wouldn't because he was a stepfather in this situation. And there was also, to a certain extent, that, I mean, we still have this today, but it was so much more acute then that, like young men will be wild and they'll go out and they'll sow their oats and they'll do wild and crazy things and cause trouble, but then they'll mature and be responsible adults. And sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not. And I think the permission for that sort of behavior, especially for wealthy aristocratic men who often went to school and were fairly unsupervised at university at a time when they were often younger than we go to school now, it could be a very poor combination for certain characters. And that was certainly what happened in this case.
Poor Mr. Madison. I mean, he was really gratified to have Dolly Madison in his life. She was an extraordinary partner in every sense of the term and great hostess. She was able to overcome his introversion and shyness and be a more public figure. During Jefferson's 2 terms, his daughters came up only for very short visits, mostly his eldest daughter, Martha, and so he was alone. He wrote a letter saying that he and Meriwether Lewis were as lonely as 2 church mice in the White House, Lewis living in the East Room, Jefferson in his own private quarters. During his White House time, he needed a hostess at times, and it was frequently Dolly Madison who would come and handle the the lubrication of the social event and be the hostess at the table and take the lead. But sometimes Margaret Bayard Smith played that role too. And so Jefferson was deeply grateful for these women. And he had a capacity for friendship with women that I think indicates that he was not a predatory man. But there's something kind of charming and beautiful about this story. And Margaret Bayard Smith provides many of the anecdotes we have of the Jefferson presidency, and then, of course, those who followed him too, that she sort of writes down these little incidents that we otherwise would not know had it not been for her. For example, the day of the inauguration. I want to go to that because it's just such a magnificent story. So this is March 4th, 1801. And she wrote a letter to her sister, Susan B. Smith, that is one of the great letters of American history. And I want to just quote to you the first section of it. She says, "Let me write to you, my dear Susan, ere that glow of enthusiasm has fled, which now animates my feelings. Let me congratulate not only you, but all my fellow citizens on an event which will have so auspicious an influence on their political welfare. And now this. I have this morning witnessed one of the most interesting scenes a free people can ever witness. The changes of administration which in every government and in every age have most generally been epochs of confusion, villainy, and bloodshed, in this our happy country take place without any species of distraction or disorder." You can't hear that, Lindsay, today without a kind of spasm of angst over what happened in 2020. That she's talking about the fragility of a republic. If you have frequent elections and one party's out and another is in, one president is out, another is in, her sense is, and she's a good student of history, that this usually involves confusion, villainy, and bloodshed. But in this our happy country, she saw the transfer of power in a beautiful and graceful way. Now, John Adams had skipped out, but that's another question. It's an incredible statement. It's an incredible statement that she makes, isn't it?
I love this letter, and I love the letters that were written at the time. And I'd actually say the same that were written in 1797 when Adams first takes office. And what's remarkable about them is that the people there had a very clear sense that they were living through history and that they were seeing something extraordinary. And they understood how fragile and delicate the bonds of government were. They understood how important the precedents and norms that they were trying to cultivate were. And they had awe and respect and just admiration for the fact that they were able to do this thing that doesn't usually happen. I think that we as Americans kind of forgot that these things do take intention, and they are fragile and they're not guaranteed. And Lord knows that's one of the themes that I've been talking about a lot lately, but also we'll be talking a lot with my forthcoming book, because I think we just got used to it. We just assumed that would always be so until we saw how much very not so it can go on January 6, 2021. We just kind of took it for granted.
Lindsay, it's important for us to remember that there was a huge controversy over Jefferson's installation as president. It was the 36 ballots in the House of Representatives before he was finally installed. The Electoral College tied over a quirk of the Constitution. There was talk of invasion of the District of Columbia by the Virginians, and the Federalists also thought they might have to fight for the future of the country. Jefferson actually said, maybe we dissolve the Constitution here and start over so we can get something that is less volatile. So this was an extremely tense moment in American history. And the question was, this was the first time that one party, let's call them the Federalists, Washington and John Adams, were leaving power, and a new party, we'll call them the Jefferson Republicans, were entering power. And the question was, will this go without chaos? And nobody could be entirely sure right up until the end. And then when she says that it did happen in the right way, a norm was established. And it's so interesting, her use of language here. She says, in this, our happy country, the transfer takes place without any species. So she's already established it as a norm. She didn't say it took place this morning in this way. She said, this is the way we're going to do things in the United States. And I so agree with you that we fell asleep, didn't we? We thought it would always be this way. And suddenly in 2020, we had a disruptor as the incumbent president who refused to accept the results of the election and planned an actual coup d'etat, which led to an insurrection on Capitol Hill on the 6th of January, 2021. And I think every one of us, I remember exactly where I was when the news came. I'm sure you do too. And we all thought, this doesn't happen in America. This can't happen in America. And then we realized there are no guarantees. This is all about norms and values. There's no enforcement of the peaceful transfer of power.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. So much of this process and this system is not written down. There's nothing that says that it has to be peaceful. There are things that sort of lay out how it's supposed to go, but most of them have been written in the last 50 years. And so there was extra nothing in 1800 and 1801. And what I think that we sometimes forget is we think our institutions are so powerful. The guardrails were hold and all of this stuff, but all of those things are powerful because we trust in them and we uphold them, and they require civil participation constantly because most of our society is not enforced through military might. Most of it is enforced through acquiescence by the civilian population, and norms and precedents are the epitome of that. They are us saying this is what we expect people to do, and we will uphold those expectations. And if we stop upholding them, then there isn't really a whole lot to prevent them from falling apart.
Your man John Adams did skulk out of the city at 4 a.m. and avoided the inauguration. And I know that he was mourning over the death of his son Charles. There are many good reasons for him just to want to slip away. But Jefferson regarded it as a double fault. First, that it was ungentlemanly. A friend ought to be there. This is what gentlemen do for each other. And secondly, that the Constitution really needs this visual symbol of the transfer of power from one person to another. Is there a defense of John Adams?
Yeah, there is. So first of all, a lot of those criticisms that Jefferson wrote came later. They were not in the moment. And if we look at a lot of the response to John Adams leaving at the moment, it's pretty clear that there was not necessarily an expectation of him staying. And in fact, there was not a tradition of a president who has lost staying for an inauguration until the 1850s. So this was not a precedent that had been established. The most important point is actually this. The election had been such a debacle, had been such a scene, had been such a circus, and it had been so unclear what the outcome was actually going to be, whether it was going to be Jefferson or it was going to be Burr. And you're right. And I hope that, I think we kind of downplay the seriousness with which people felt everything could go to hooey in 1 minute, and the threat of violence has been really underreported in history books because I think that they kind of tried to tamp down that later and pretend like it didn't really happen. I think that Adams worried that his presence would be a distraction. It would add to the sense that this was a sort of a circus. He worried that it would detract from the moment, and he genuinely wanted. Now, it's not to say he wasn't also bitter about losing, and he wasn't upset about his son. Those things are true, and he wanted to get to Baltimore that first day. The stages from Washington, D.C. were relatively few and far between. So all of those things are true. He is both bitter. He doesn't want to be there. He's unhappy about it. But I also firmly believe that he was trying to do what he thought would be best to give Jefferson a fresh slate and to help him start on sort of a clean page. Because all of his other actions in the transition period and in the immediate weeks following were nothing but conciliatory. And he instructed his cabinet to cooperate. He instructed them to offer assistance in any way. He really set the tone. So there's a lot to criticize, but I do think that there's actually good faith. There's a good faith argument that there was no precedent of this, and he was genuinely trying to do what he thought was right.
Just a note to our audience, you have now heard Lindsay make the best defense that can be made of this unprofessional moment in John Adams' life. You know that Jefferson was right, that we do need that transfer. We do need to see the outgoing person be gracious towards the incoming publicly, that this is political theater, right? Can I ask a
question?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Do you think that the inauguration day this year or in 2021 would have been better if Trump was there?
Well, that's a whole different subject.
Point is this. Obviously, I'm not in any way comparing Adams to Trump because that would be a horrific insult. But what I'm saying is sometimes when there is there is so much chaos and there is a threat of violence, having that person there can actually be a distraction. I agree with you in general about the handoff of power. I'm not disagreeing, and I think that's a lovely tradition in American history. But I do think that we're looking backwards a little bit if we say that with all of our knowledge since then, he should have had it at the same time.
Fair enough. However, one last thing, and this is really in support of you. John Adams loved Thomas Jefferson. It's not clear that Jefferson loved John Adams. He esteemed him. But Adams actually loved Jefferson. He forgave him. There never would have been a reconciliation without John Adams. John Adams did the heavy emotional lifting in the reconciliation. He had many, many good reasons to be bitter about Jefferson in a way that Jefferson did not have equally good reasons to be bitter about John Adams, and yet Adams did the right thing and restored the friendship. So he's the bigger man, in my view. It does seem a little strange. When we come back, I want to read a little bit more of this letter, and I want to ask you one further question about transfer of power. Stay with us, everyone. This is a special edition of Listening to America with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, 10 Things about Margaret Bayard Smith. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. Lindsay Chervinsky, 10 Things about Margaret Bayard Smith. You know, we were talking about Adams leaving town on the 4 a.m. stage to Baltimore, not staying for Jefferson's inauguration. Was it a slight, or was it good sense on the part of John Adams that enough is enough? And at this point, nobody really knew what the protocols were for this sort of thing. We get it. Here's my question for you. Many people today say that what happened on January 6, 2021 was a protest that got a little out of hand, or maybe aggressive tourism, or that it's been overplayed. Was it or was it not what we have to call an attempt at a coup d'etat?
Oh, it was absolutely an attempt at a coup. The purpose of the people there was to disrupt the counting of the electoral votes and to overthrow them. They were quite explicit about that in their own language, in their own posts. The guilty pleas that the Department of Justice have secured confirm that. So if you look at people like Elise Stefanik and Lindsey Graham and hardcore Republicans, right afterwards, they said this was unacceptable. Everyone needs to be held to account. This was an insurrection. I mean, I love this country so much, and I just don't understand. It just horrifies me.
I feel the same way. Just one last point about that. You know, in 2000, when G.W. Bush narrowly edged out Al Gore in an election that still has many mysteries about it, Al Gore gave a fabulous, gracious speech. Gore's partisans didn't attack the Capitol and try to prevent the transfer of power from Bill Clinton to G.W. Bush. That's the norm as late as 2000. And yet in 2020, there are people who say, well, if the election was stolen, we have a right then to take back the government by force. And that is a very, very depressing conclusion. I want to go back to this letter on March 4th, 1801 to Susan B. Smith by Margaret Bayard Smith. She's talked about the transfer of power, which I think is it's the classical statement of the peaceful transfer of power in American life. That's how great she was as a writer. She goes on to say, I cannot describe the agitation I felt while I looked on around in the various multitude, and while I listened to an address, the inaugural address, containing principles the most correct, sentiments the most liberal, and wishes the most benevolent, conveyed in the most appropriate and elegant language, and in a manner mild as it was firm. If doubts of the integrity and talents of Mr. Jefferson ever existed in the minds of anyone, methinks this address must forever eradicate them. The Senate chamber was so crowded that I believe not another creature could enter. On one side of the house the Senate sat, the other was resigned by the representatives to the ladies. The roof is arched, the room half-circle, every inch of ground was occupied. It has been conjectured by several gentlemen whom I asked that there were near 1,000 persons within the walls. The speech was delivered in so low a tone that few heard it. Again, the details we get from her, we get from no other source. And then she has one, and at the end of the letter, she says something so important that it really helps us understand who Jefferson was. And this may make you gag, of course, Lindsay, but when he went back to the boarding house, Conrad and McMunn's, where he'd been staying during the transition, he had been accustomed to seat at a group of other individuals, mostly men, at the far end of the table, as far away from the fireplace as anybody. This was his way of being gracious. He goes back after the inauguration. When he walks in, people start to get up to give him pride of place at the best seat in the house. He says, "Oh, no. I'm accustomed to sitting across the. I'd be quite happy there." And she says, "That's who Thomas Jefferson is. That's Thomas Jefferson, this mild man of the people." That's good political theater, you have to admit.
Oh, yeah, it's great. I mean, I don't know that Jefferson was a man of the people, but he was utterly brilliant at the political symbolism. I mean, there was almost no one better who understood how to display principles through selection of clothing and transportation and, I mean, you name it, he could whatever however he had composed himself on any given moment was with such intention. And, that's still very much how politics works today. We always talk about the American maid for inauguration. And, when Melania wore that jacket that said, "I really don't care, do you?" I mean, like, clothes and presentation are so important to politics. And he was a master at that game.
So here's this gracious man that she's piling it on a little here. She said nobody could doubt him after hearing this inaugural address. Well, many did. But even John Marshall, who hated him more or less, said, "Yeah, pretty good speech. It was a pretty conciliatory speech after all." What's the thing that sticks in your throat about Jefferson? I mean, here, there was no more polite and gracious a man in this era than he. And yet, for some reason, you find him duplicitous or annoying in some important way.
It's the duplicity that bothers me. I actually have done a fair amount of reflecting on this lately because I've been doing a lot of other reading for future projects. And I was reading a lot about FDR, and I was like, what is it about FDR that's bothering me? Like, something was sticking in my craw. It was really just like annoying me. And I realized that Jefferson and FDR are the same person. They're both brilliant communicators about democracy. They both have a lot of personal sorrow in their life. They're very hard to get to know. They kept pretty much everyone at arm's length. They were master politicians. They could make people do what they wanted in the way that they wanted them to be done. And they were often two-faced about it. They could be quite duplicitous and dishonest. And that made them brilliant politicians. I in no way challenge their skill or their ability to get things done, but it makes me like them a little bit less. Not like dislike their principles, but just personally feel a little bit grossed out by it in a way that, like, Theodore Roosevelt was so freaking honest about who he was, and John Quincy Adams was so freaking honest, and they're in some ways much less effective, but I love them for it. And so that's just my own personal, I think every historian has to approach their subjects in their own way and choose their subjects in their own way. And so I can appreciate Jefferson. I can write in short quantities about Jefferson. I can't live with Jefferson for the years that you have lived with Jefferson because he annoys me.
Fast forward, Jefferson leaves office peacefully on March 4th, 1809. He would have been elected almost certainly to a third term. He hands it off to his closest friend, James Madison. There's this lovely letter, March 6th, 1809, from Jefferson to Margaret Bayard Smith, because she said, one of the last times she was in his office at the White House, she said, "Please give me something so I can remember you when you go away. And I know I may never see you. Yes, we're planning to come, but, it's a long..."
Listeners, I'm rolling my eyes.
She says, "Please give me a token of something that I can cherish as much as I cherish you." And so he gave her a geranium. This is what he says in the letter. He gave her a plant. They both love plants. And here's the letter.
It's not a very good plant. It's kind of low on the plant scale.
He writes it in kind of the 18th century third person. To Mrs. Samuel H. Smith, Washington, March 6, 1809. Thomas Jefferson presents his respectful salutations to Mrs. Smith and sends her the geranium she expressed a willingness to receive. It is in very bad condition, having been neglected latterly, as not intended to be removed. In other words, he didn't intend to take it back to Monticello, so he was going to just let it die. But now she has it. He cannot give it his parting blessing more effectually than by consigning it to the nourishing hand of Mrs. Smith. If plants have sensibility, as the analogy of their organization with ours seems to indicate. He's thinking plants have brains. If plants have sensibility, it cannot but be proudly sensible of her fostering attentions, of his regrets at parting with the society of Washington. A very sensible portion attaches to Mrs. Smith, etc. And then he invites them to come to Monticello. You gotta love that. She took this this half-hearted geranium and brought it back to life. And this was her memory of the great man. No one asked Adams for a plant.
Did she bring it back to life? I hope she had more skill with inside plants than I do. I killed them.
Wow, wow, wow. All right. They promised to come to Monticello. They do. August 1st, 1809. And there's a long, long account of it. They come, and what the most important thing for me in this letter is that she says, what an isolated wilderness this thing is. There's nobody here. We're going up these roads. They're in deplorable condition. It's woods every direction. It's not even clear that civilization can exist here. And we come around this corner, and Jefferson is riding his horse on his daily exercise. He greets us. He brings us back to the house. He serves us tea. And it's an amazing letter about sort of the Gothic nature of Virginia at this time. So it's an immense letter. I urge everyone to read it. But she does address slavery, and she didn't have to because, as you know, the tacit arrangement, the contract with Jefferson is that you never mention it. That's the price of friendship with Jefferson, that you just agree never to bring it up, even if you feel ardently about it. And John Adams, when he finally wrote to Jefferson about slavery in 1820, said, I've never really wanted to raise this with you. I've always been inhibited from raising this question. And so she says this. She's walking around, because Jefferson, even when he has them there, Jefferson spends the day in his study and in the fields. And after breakfast, you're all on your own until dinner, which would be about 3 p.m. And she says, she's taking a walk. It is generally shady, with openings through the trees for distant views. We pass the outhouses for the slaves and workmen. They are all much better than I have seen on any other plantation, but to an eye unaccustomed to such sights, they appear poor, and their cabins form a most unpleasant contrast with the palace that rises so near them. It's pretty strong, I think, don't you?
She also says towards the end, his low and mild voice harmonizes with his countenance rather than his figure, but his manners, how gentle, how humble, how kind. His meanest slave must feel as if it were a father instead of a master who addressed him when he speaks.
Yeah, you're right. That's disgusting. That's just disgusting. I mean, that's the old trope has been through most of my life. I'm much older than you. The trope has been, yes, he was a slaveholder, but he was the best slaveholder who ever lived. And that's just crap, That's just being in denial. But then she says this. So he takes them into his sanctum sanctorum, his famous study, and nobody gets in that study. And he shows her stuff. He does a whole little show and tell thing. So she says his suite of apartments opens from the hall. It consists of 3 rooms for the library, 1 for his cabinet, which is his sort of office, 1 for his chamber, his bedchamber, and a greenhouse. He has not yet made his collection, having just finished the room, which opens to one of the terraces. He showed us everything he thought would please or interest us. His most valuable and curious books, those which contained fine prints. Among these, I thought the most curious were the original letters of Cortez to the King of Spain, a volume of fine views of ancient villas around Rome, with maps, and minute descriptions of the buildings and grounds. An old poem written by Piers Plowman, a great medieval poem, printed 250 years ago. He read near a page of Middle English, which was almost as unintelligible as if it were Hebrew, and some Greek romances. He took pains to find one that was translated into French, and on and on and on. So he's doing the whole Jefferson treatment, that he's a polymath, that he has a greenhouse, that he has exquisite manners, he has incredible folios of plates of the Roman ruins, that he can read Middle English and read some aloud. You got to say, this is a very charming moment.
It is, but then, I thought you were going to get to this sentence, but she basically says, I thought it would have looked better if it was 1 big room instead of 3 little rooms. It would have been more impressive.
So when Anna Thornton came, Mrs. Thornton, the wife of the designer of Washington, came earlier during his presidency, she said, man, he never really finishes anything, does he? He says the whole place is like it's a building site, and there are scaffolds and bricks are falling down, and he lives in serenity in the midst of this chaos. I think that was generally felt. And she says it takes him a long time to complete his projects, and she says there's something droll about this house. You've been in the house many times. You know there is something droll about this house.
Very odd house. I mean, it's obviously very unique. There are certain rooms that are exquisite. The public reception rooms or the family, sort of where he would have hosted guests, was exquisite. The entry hall is very unusual for its decor. His suite of rooms are lovely. But the upstairs space where his family and guests would have stayed are really quite plain.
So it was a great trip, and she found him in tranquility and serenity. She said the storms of his great political career are over now. He's achieved a serenity that we never saw in Washington because he was so busy trying to promote the freedom and the rights of humankind. It's a great letter by his principal admirer amongst women, and in some ways a groupie. I want to just fast forward to 1816, Lindsay. In 1816, she writes him an alarmed letter about tax being made on him for being an atheist. And she's seen that this has somehow gone public, and she writes him this letter, and he writes Ben one of his great letters. He says, "Don't worry about this. They don't know who I am." And he said, "Because I believe in religious freedom," quote, "my enemies wished him in third person, wished him to be thought an atheist, deist, or devil, merely for advocating freedom from their religious dictations. He says that the test of a person's religion is their life, and he's quite willing to be judged on that score, and he believes that her religion must be good too, whatever it is. He wouldn't inquire because of the greatness of her life. He says, but this does not satisfy the priesthood. They must have a declared assent to all their interested absurdities. And then he says this, one of his most quoted lines, "My opinion is that there never would have been an infidel if there had never been a priest." So that's one of the things you have to admire, I know, about Jefferson is his extraordinary commitment to freedom of religious thought, expression, and observance, that he is America's single greatest champion amongst the founders of unlimited freedom of the human conscience.
It's probably my favorite thing about him.
And he says it beautifully.
Yeah.
He wasn't an atheist. He was a deist, although that's sort of in the suburbs. He believed that Jesus was the greatest man who ever lived, or nearly so, but only a man. He disbelieved in the Trinity. He said terrible things about organized religion at times. He said, "Priests are like cuttlefish. They spread an inky, black gloom through the very medium in which they move." That's amazing.
He had more of a sense of humor sometimes than I give him credit for, because that's really quite funny.
It is, but this is the sort of thing that drove his enemies nuts. And it all sort of began with notes on the state of Virginia, in which Jefferson said that it doesn't matter whether you believe in one God or 20 or none at all, that neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And even though he said terrible things about African Americans and was in denial about slavery and had a lot of other weird stuff, the sentence that came back to haunt him all his life was saying that it doesn't matter whether you believe in one God or 20 or none at all, that neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And the people that love to be Puritans and righteous really got a lot of mileage out of that one sentence, which is one reason, as you know, why Jefferson did not want to print Notes on Virginia, or if he did print it, he wanted to control the distribution very, very carefully.
His own personal views on religion, which I greatly admire, the private nature of his faith. I think that's quite admirable. At one point, John Adams said, "What does this have anything to do with how he would be as a president?" But to his discredit, did not really say anything against the Federalist attacks. And that actually really opened him up to attacks in his own way, because he was much more established in his religious view. And so a lot of Republicans were able to curry favor with some of the other religious sects that were more minorities about the importance of religious freedom.
I don't blame John Adams for that at all, Lindsay. I think that he was extraordinarily respectful of Jefferson. And later in his life, when Jefferson and Adams are writing about religion, Adams is at least a proto-deist himself and a proto-Unitarian, much more of a free thinker than I think he's mostly been understood to have been. So they weren't that far apart. They were both men of the Enlightenment. The only difference, I think, is Adams believed there has to be some religious glue to hold the lusts and passions of humankind in check. And Jefferson's view was, from the Scottish Enlightenment, no, there's a moral sense, and people can get this right without any formal religious apparatus. I think that's the only way in which they really disagreed much about that question. But let me ask a closing question. We're out of time. We owe a lot to Margaret Bayard Smith.
We do, and there's a lot of the historical record that is preserved in her letters, for which I am extraordinarily grateful. And one can only hope that there are more letters of more women like her that are still tucked away in attics somewhere. and will come to light as we go forward.
We're out of time. I've so enjoyed this, Lindsay. I think you're almost a believer. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.